Okay, our next speaker is Hossein Jamali. And Hussein is also a PhD student who works in clinical recurrence of clinical mastitis. And he's currently studying in the Department of Pathology and Microbiology at the University of Montreal. And he'll speak to us about a meta-analysis on clinical mastitis recurrence in dairy cows. Thank you, Hussein.
Thank you. Hello, everyone. I'm going to present a systematic review and meta-analysis of clinical mastitis recurrence in dairy cows. Clinical mastitis is one of the most frequent and costly disease in dairy farms worldwide because of treatment costs, milk losses, extra labor, decreased milk quality, and increased probability of death and culling. Recurrent clinical mastitis is a very frustrating aspect of clinical mastitis. Cow had a clinical mastitis in this current lactation and then suffered again with the disease. Recurrent clinical mastitis was reported in 14% to 48% of cows. Recurrent clinical mastitis episodes in the same quarter could be caused by a recurrent intramammary infection. In this case, the infection was cured, but the quarter is infected again, or may be associated with persistent intramammary infection. In this case, infection was not cured, so pathogen is there, but there is no clinical mastitis symptoms. And we have another clinical mastitis in the same quarter later. So it is not clear that the risk of clinical mastitis after an initial clinical mastitis is increased, maintained, or decreased. So the first objective of this study was compare risk of clinical mastitis of cows that had a clinical mastitis in current lactation to risk of clinical mastitis in healthy cows. And as well as describe these factors for clinical mastitis recurrence. In this presentation, I focus on the first objective. So the study was a systematic review and meta-analysis of the literature. Systematic review is a type of literature review that collects and critically analyzes multiple studies, and meta-analysis is using for combine the results of quantitative studies. We searched 3 databases, includes Web of Science, PubMed, and CAPS for the published paper after 1989. And inclusion criteria were original manuscript in English or French, naturally occurring clinical mastitis because experimental challenge could not give us more about in this case. And design is not case report, case series, or expert opinion, as they are not in high validity of a study design. Does not involve tropical breeds. We were looking for commercial cows, and we also excluded the the studies that reported clinical mastitis in very small dairy farms, such as family farms with some cows. For meta-analysis part, we excluded the studies that only reported clinical mastitis in first parity cows because we wanted cow in different parity, and also we excluded the papers that reported clinical mastitis in cows that didn't follow for a complete lactation, because in most of these studies, the cows were followed for 2 months of the first lactation, and we don't know if they had more clinical mastitis or not. Then we extracted some data such as number of followed co-lactations, number of followed co-lactations with 1 or more and 2 or more clinical mastitis cases. And the risk ratio was computed for each study. Risk ratio is risk of clinical mastitis for cows that has a clinical mastitis in the same in the current lactation divided by risk of clinical mastitis of healthy cows. As I said, we can use meta-analysis for combine the result of different studies, but some studies has some characteristics that maybe influence the result. So we use meta-regression to find that find that source of data that were used in the studies, and clinical mastitis recurrence cases case definition or minimum days between 2 cases influence the result or not. Okay, this figure shows follow-up information through the different phases of the systematic review. 1,465 and 884 papers were identified through different databases and also other sources. After duplicates removed, 1,666 papers were screened, and finally 57 articles included in the systematic review, and 9 of them were selected for meta-analysis. Okay, these 9 articles were divided based on the source of studies. 6 studies used prospective data collection, and 3 studies used existing database. And they also divided two groups based on clinical mastitis recurrence definition. 6 studies used minimum of 5 to 21 days between clinical mastitis cases, and 3 studies used maximum 24 hours. Individual study risk ratio ranged from around 0.8 to 2. Meta-regression shows that source of data has a little influence on the result and explain only 4% of risk ratio variance. However, clinical definition or minimal log time between 2 clinical mastitis has a big influence and explain around 60% of variance. Okay, this figure shows forest plot of risk of clinical mastitis event among cows that had a clinical mastitis in the current lactation compared to risk in healthy cows in 3 studies with clinical mastitis definition, maximum 24 hours between cases. So, sorry. Okay, as you can see, these 3 different studies, all of them shows that the risk of clinical mastitis in cows that had a clinical mastitis is increased, is higher than the risk of clinical mastitis in healthy cows. And when we combine the result, and when we compare the result with meta-analysis, the result shows that risk ratio is around 1.5. It means when you have a clinical mastitis in the current lactation, you will be 1.5 more likely to have a recurrent clinical mastitis. This figure shows forest plot of risk of clinical mastitis event among cows having already experienced a clinical mastitis case in the current lactation compared to risk in healthy cows in 6 studies with clinical mastitis definition between more than 5 days between cases. So as you can see, half of the studies shows that the risk of clinical mastitis is higher in cows that had a clinical mastitis, and half of them said is less than. Okay, so when we combine all the results together with meta-analysis, the result shows that the risk is 1. So the result shows that the risk of clinical mastitis recurrence in cows that had a clinical mastitis is same as the risk in healthy cows. Based on our results, cows are almost equally susceptible to clinical mastitis after a first case. And clinical mastitis case definition, however, appears to greatly affect the computed risk ratio. Most important differences were noted when comparing studies using maximum 24 hours to that using more than 5 or more than 5 days between cases. For your information, we also identified some risk factors from the 57 articles. For example, we found that older cow, beginning of the lactation, high production, having a staph aureus in preceding clinical mastitis case, and not having bacteriological cure following preceding case could be risk factors for clinical mastitis recurrence. Thank you so much for your attention.
Do we have any questions for Hossein? There's a question there in the center. Could you just wait on the mic, please?
Okay, thank you. And congratulations on a nice presentation.
Thank you.
I have 2 questions. My first question is, I think your unit is the cow, regardless of quarter. Is that correct?
Yeah.
So you could have a recurrence in a different quarter.
Yeah.
Or a recurrence in the same quarter.
With the papers that we found from the databases, most of them reported in co-level.
So it could be either one, though. So it's a combined actual recurrence and also multiple cases of mastitis in a cow.
Yeah, because some papers reported that if a cow had another clinical mastitis is recurrent, and some papers said no, if a quarter.
Yes. Yeah.
So we use a co-level, it's not the quarter.
Okay. And then the second question I have is simply, how did you standardize the definition of clinical mastitis itself? Not the recurrence, not the less than 5 or 24, but what is clinical mastitis in these different studies?
I didn't understand the question.
Like in many different studies, sometimes clinical mastitis means you have a sick cow. Okay. Sometimes clinical mastitis means you're CMT3. Sometimes clinical mastitis means you're conductivity positive. Sometimes it means you have flakes. Sometimes it's a swollen quarter.
Okay, this one is the clinical mastitis is when we have the clinical mastitis symptoms. So without symptoms, we cannot say this one is clinical mastitis.
Yeah, so that was my question on, do you know what the definition of clinical mastitis actually was in these various studies? Because it varies enormously.
Yeah, there's 3 grades for severity for clinical mastitis with different symptoms. So if we have one of them, we can say the cause is suffered by clinical mastitis also.
All right, thank you.
You're welcome.
One question here at the front.
Hi, Juan Manuel Ariza from France. when you perform your meta-analysis, you integrate the hair level in your model to adjust the effectiveness of the treatments, or the...
We use the data, the data that were reported in the papers that we selected. So all of them are in co-level, most of them, not all of them. So we use the data for that. I'm not sure I understand very well the question.
Because in meta-analysis you can integrate the intra-class, inter-herd
No,
correlation.
it's from the co-level.
Yeah, but in
COVID-1 clinical mastitis or more, COVID-2 clinical mastitis or more, or healthy cows.
Okay, thank you.
You're welcome.
Thank you very much, Hossein.
Thanks.